would it be an over-exaggeration to say if there's no phytoplankton, there's no human life?
I think, yeah, that would not be exaggerated at all.
When I say plankton, what do you think about? SpongeBob SquarePants, some tiny creatures, or nothing at all? We all should know more about it.
Phytoplankton in total are as important as rainforests for the carbon cycle.
Our lives depend on it. The climate depends on it. The entire food chain in the ocean starts with it. And yet, I don't know anything about plankton. That's why I sat down with Professor Dr. Elisa Schaum. She's an oceanographer turned evolutionary biologist, and she heads the research group for plankton ecology and evolution at University of Hamburg. The question I was most anxious about is, if my life depends on it, how healthy are plankton actually? And that's what Elisa is trying to figure out as well. And let me say one thing, her research is a bit of a mix of Jurassic Park and Back to the Future.
We can go back in time, and sometimes if that's not enough, we can substitute time for space.
Join us as we travel through time in this episode of Where the Ocean Meets Dr. Elisa Schaum.
Where the Ocean Meets.
Elisa, your lab can basically predict the future of the oceans. Can you explain to me how that works?
Using the fantastic work that modelers are doing, for example, we're looking at what are possible scenarios for how the climate is going to change, and then we're looking at, and so what are the plausible, what are some plausible scenarios in which organisms may react, and how could that then feed back into climate dynamics? And for that, there's many things that we can do. I think all of them are a little bit like time travel, actually. So, for example, 3 main ways in which we can do it. In which I think the people in my group, they're super smart, and they do this really well. So 3 main ways, and one of them is looking into the past. So, for example, what we can do is we can look at sediment cores. And sometimes, if they're very lucky in the sediment cores, the deeper that we look, we can still extract organisms and revive them. They're going to have been asleep for a long time. Like the oldest one that we've got in the lab alive at the moment is 200 years old, came from a sediment layer that is 200 years old, and if it's a species that forms something that we call a resting stage, for example, or a cyst, then those can come back to life, can come back from their sleep in the laboratory, and we can look at how they behave under different environmental conditions. And we can do that for the 200-year-old, we can do that for the 100-year-old, we can do that for the quite recent one. And by doing so, because we do have for certain regions, especially the Baltic Sea, for example, we do have quite good metadata, for lack of a better word. We know quite well how it has changed in terms of the temperature and the nutrients and the pollution and these kind of things.
When you say you can bring something back to life, what kind of life are we speaking about? Are those plants? Are those animals?
Oh, unicellular life, yeah.
Okay.
Unicellular life. So these are photosynthetic organisms that we work with. So my lab mainly works on phytoplankton, which are small organisms living in the water column that are important because they make oxygen, and they also take up carbon dioxide, which means that they are an important part of what we call the biological carbon pump. So without the life in the oceans, yes, the oceans would still be taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, simply because there's more in the atmosphere than there is in the ocean, but this process will be quite slow. So it's really the biology that makes the oceans act as carbon sinks, largely.
And just from my
So these are the
understanding,
organisms that we...
what is or maybe what is plankton in general, and then more specifically, what is phytoplankton?
Okay. Yes, maybe. So plankton in general are small organisms that are in the water that can't, at least not to a large degree, decide where they go. Like a fish isn't plankton because the fish can swim on its own accord, and it can swim against the current if the current isn't too strong, whereas phytoplankton mainly disperse, or plankton in general disperse, or they float with the currents. They can control to a small degree where they sit in the depth of the water, but they can't swim over long distances. So plankton comes from Greek. It means it's the wanderer or the drifter. right? So it's organisms that drift in the water and can't really decide, that have very little control about over where they're going, or less control than, say, a whale or turtle or another large organism, right? So those are plankton. And then there's zooplankton, which is animal-like creatures, and then there's phytoplankton, which is mainly plant-like creatures.
Okay.
And we do the phytoplankton and the associated organisms.
Okay, perfect. And then just another thing, the carbon pump. Could you quickly explain
Yes.
how this thing works? I'm just opening a lot of parentheses here before we go back to time traveling, which is obviously super fascinating.
Okay, so the carbon pump, there's different types, and they all have to do with how does carbon get into the ocean. Humans are quite interested in that because when carbon is going into the ocean, it's no longer in the atmosphere, right? So that's one of the. It's also just really interesting scientifically and mechanistically what happens. But I think a lot of the interest stems from that. It's for us, it's a good thing. It's a good thing that there's a carbon pump because it reduces the amount of certain greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because the gas goes into the ocean. So carbon dioxide goes into the ocean. As I mentioned, there's chemical and physical ways it can go in, and those are often a little bit slow, especially if it's, if it depends merely on the difference of partial pressure, so on the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere versus in the ocean. That would be very slow. That would be super slow. And the carbon pump really refers to this carbon being pumped into deeper layers of the ocean, and the biological carbon pump in particular refers to the bringing of carbon into deeper layers of the ocean through biological activity. That's mainly done about poop, really. So because if we've got the phytoplankton and they get eaten and then they get pooped out in something that we call a fecal pellet, that fecal pellet is going to be a lot heavier than, say, a single phytoplankton cell, right? A single phytoplankton cell has about the same density as seawater sometimes, so it just sits there and it doesn't really sink very quickly. But a fecal pellet is going to sink, thereby removing that carbon as a package to deeper layers of the ocean. And we can spin this also further up the food web, but then we have the even larger organisms that eat the zooplankton, and then the carbon gets transferred to that layer, to that layer of the food web. We can make that, we can spin that tail as far as we want to, but basically it means that once we involve biological activity, the carbon gets turned from something that's a gas into something that's in an organism, and that organism can sink. The bigger it is, or the heavier or the stickier it is, the faster it's going to sink there, and by this process pumping the carbon into the deeper ocean, and eventually, if it doesn't get eaten on its long journey to the ground,
and then
as far as the carbon is
after
concerned,
a million years, this might turn into oil that we're now pumping up and releasing into the atmosphere again? Or?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
Super interesting. And what you're doing now is like the carbon or the particles that sank 200 years ago and settled into the sediment, you're digging those up and in the lab you can bring them back to life.
Yes, I can't, but some people can.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. And then quite nicely we can compare them to more recent organisms, and as long as we've got the environmental information, we can link the environment to some of the traits that the organism might be displaying. So, for example, that could be how much are they photosynthesizing, and that again is quite interesting because if they're photosynthesizing a lot, again, they are more of a carbon sink. They're taking more carbon dioxide than they're producing. We can look at how large they are. That, as we mentioned just a few seconds ago, that can have to do then with how fast could they sink, possibly who could eat them. So these are all traits that we're interested in, and we can link them to a degree then to the environment as long as we have the parameters that we need. So that's one way in which we time travel. That's by going back in time. But of course, the issue with climate change at the moment, or the climate breakdown, as it's also sometimes called, is that it's so fast, and it's a lot faster than any of the records that we have in the sediment we can't really extrapolate from that. We can say something about, okay, with the change that has happened, these have been the consequences, but we can't, or maybe we shouldn't really say, and based on this, we predict that in the future, this is going to be this and this and this and this, right? So it's a nice stepping stone. It tells us what is possible, especially if, say, if we compare more recent strains to pre-industrial ones, we can observe the change that has happened already. But it's not our best predictive tool. It gives us an idea of the potential, how likely are these organisms to do a certain thing under certain circumstances. But the past circumstances don't really reflect, I think, what's in store in the future.
If you dig up something from 200 years ago, and then you dig up something from 100 years ago, you look at the productiveness of the photosynthesis of these organisms, and you compare how productive was it 200 years ago, how productive was it 100 years ago. Is there a discrepancy? And if you take a similar organism from today, you would look at the productiveness of that cell and say, is it more or less productive than 200 years ago or 100 years ago? And that helps you model. Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, for example, exactly. So yes, that's pretty much what we do. It would be nice, of course, if we had data in 5-year steps, but that is that's the dream, right? But that we don't have. So we've got a couple of time points, and we were lucky in a project that one of a recent PhD graduate did, that we did have pre-industrial strains, and then we had some that were more recent, and some from like 20 years ago or 30 maybe, which spanned quite nicely the pre-industrial time, the time in which the Baltic Sea was already becoming warmer and more eutrophied, and then the super rapid warming that the Baltic Sea has seen from like the 1980s onwards. And yes, we take these and we compare them to each other. And I think what's important here is that we compare them to each other across a range of environments again, right? So we take the 200-year-old gentle lady and gentleman strains of our phytoplankton, and we test them in a really large range of temperatures to get an idea of how thermally tolerant did they used to be, and at which temperatures did they use to photosynthesize the most, for example. And we do the same for the others as well. And
so you put them in different aquarium and heat them up at different temperatures?
Small aquaria, yeah, very small aquaria, yes.
Oh,
Tiny aquaria. That's what we do. Yes. I remember when I was little, like in the 90s, I think, we had these little doll houses, like a Polly Pocket, so like a Polly Pocket for phytoplankton, if that means anything to anybody still. But yes, so it's very small. And yes, and in these, then we can put them at different temperatures, and we can measure some of the things that they do by using some of the fancy tools that we have. And in doing so, yes, we get an idea of how much do they photosynthesize. So does the one of them on average do more than the other? But we also get an idea of at which temperatures do they do the best in. Is it more the cooler temperatures or the warmers, or does this change depending from which layer they come from? And this helps the people who are really good at modeling, that helps them.
And
so, yes.
Can you say that the ones from 200 years ago were more resilient or better phytoplankton than we have today?
It's the other way around, actually. So at least, I mean, for the ones that we have, of course, it might be quite different for a different type of phytoplankton or at a different location, say. But for that study that we did, it turned out to be entirely the opposite. So the samples that were, I think, from the 90s, from 1990s, when the Baltic Sea was really not in the best state that it had ever been, they grew super fast, a lot faster than the cyanobacteria. Also, it's a special kind of phytoplankton than the phytoplankton that we had gotten from the older layers of the sediment, and they did so across more temperatures as well, especially temperatures that are typical Baltic Sea summer temperatures. And we do assume that this might be something that explains to a degree why these blooms of these organisms in the Baltic Sea have been becoming more prevalent, simply because they have evolved to have much faster growth rates than they used to have in pre-industrial times, for sure, but also in like the 1970s, 1980s. None of them would display these fast growth rates, and the more recent strains that we've been looking at are all much faster growers at a range of temperatures that is kind of typical for Baltic Sea summers these days.
And is that a good thing?
Is that a good thing? Well, if you are that type of phytoplankton, it's a very, very good thing, because it means you can outcompete everybody. If you are a fish that can't deal with the toxins that these particular phytoplankton produce, it's not such a good thing. And I guess if you're a fishing person or a fisherman whose income depends on not having a lot of dead fish in the hole, then it's also not a good thing. So it's actually these organisms in that particular project can be quite detrimental to many life forms in the Baltic Sea. They produce quite a strong toxin. It's the type of phytoplankton, it's the type of cyanobacteria that sometimes is responsible for the beaches on the Baltic Sea being closed in the summer. So yeah, for them it's a good thing. They're quite happy, but ecologically speaking, it's maybe not the best thing, no. But they're very good at photosynthesizing. There's that.
Yeah, because it feels like there's almost like, if I look at it from a purely egoistic human perspective, which I know is a cardinal sin in biology, it sounds like to stabilize the climate, it's a good thing.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it has the potential to kill the ocean and the life in the ocean, which I don't know what kind of consequences that would have on us humans. Yeah.
Exactly. So with that one, it's not so super clear, but that's a good thing or not. And I think the thing that you mentioned, if it starts killing some life in the ocean, that is then often associated with bacteria who really like to eat the life that has just been killed. And in doing so, what they do is they respire a lot. And respiration means that they take the oxygen and they make carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide can go back to the atmosphere. So it's tricky to say is a good thing, is it a bad thing? I think mainly if you have a nuisance bloom of something that's toxic ecologically, it's probably a bad thing. But it goes to show, I think what's important is it goes to show that there is a certain level of resilience within phytoplankton, and that they can and will evolve as the climate is changing. It stands, at least that they have already, right? So far, and that is. But as I mentioned, I think what's in store is going to far exceed the things that have happened, and that's why we also have other approaches to look at how phytoplankton can cope in a changing climate. Shall I tell you something about these, or
Yes,
anything
absolutely,
else
because I think
that you'd like to
I
add?
interrupted you in the first out of 3 ways on how you can time travel. So let's go back to time traveling. And actually, sorry to interrupt, once more,
Okay.
train of thought. What would be the consequence if phytoplankton would not have any ability to adapt to climate change? For
We'd be
me as a
screwed.
human.
We would be. I think we'd be in a lot of trouble, because what we do know is that phytoplankton in total are as important as rainforests for the carbon cycle. And if we lose that half, I think climate change would spiral out of control so fast. I mean it's the carbon cycle thing, and I think that can go quite fast with the gases and everything. So that would be bad, right? Because really we talk about the rainforest and how they're so important, and they are super important. But I am not wanting to offend people who work on large terrestrial plants. But and they are important, but the phytoplankton life in the oceans is just as important. So to lose that would be dramatic in terms of the carbon cycle. It would be dramatic as well in terms of the oxygen cycle, because of the oxygen they make, but that oxygen cycle spins quite slowly, so it would take quite a long time for that to have any kind of effect on, say, oxygen levels in the air that we breathe. I think that wouldn't be something to worry about, because that just because of the time scales that these kind of cycles operate on. But more importantly, without phytoplankton, there's no zooplankton. Without zooplankton, there's no fish. Without fish, all of the, so many societies depend on fisheries to this day. That would be the socio-economical consequences would be dramatic if that happened. I guess that would be globally. That would be a big cause for massive global unrest if that were going to happen, to put it mildly. The other thing is it depends on how does the phytoplankton go away? Or what were you envisioning? Are they all just dying one day to the other? Are they abducted by aliens, just removed from the water column?
I don't know where we can go with these scenarios. It sounds like the plot for a science fiction movie almost.
What does they? Well, so if we suppose that they all can't, that they're there and they can't evolve, so they all die, I think then we've got this issue that there's a lot of phytoplankton in the ocean. There's about 1 million cells per milliliter, and there's in the sunlit ocean light, and even the surface ocean is it's big. So there's a lot of phytoplankton there at any given moment in time, and if we now assume that none of them can evolve anymore, I guess to a degree they could probably cope with the environment just by coping, probably not very well and not forever. So eventually maybe a lot of them would just go extinct and their niches couldn't be filled because the others can't evolve to fill them. So there would be a lot of dead organic matter in the ocean, and then again I think we've got that issue with the bacteria who really like to feast on dead stuff in the ocean and who respire a lot. So that again would then lead to more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the thing that we don't want. And that'd be bad. I think it's a good thing that they can evolve. It's good that they can. Just like any other organism, right? It's just the question I think is not so much whether they can, but by who can do it best and what are the ones that can evolve the best, because those are going to be the ones likely that we're going to be seeing the most of. What are they going to be like? What are they going to be doing in the ocean? What are their traits going to be like?
Yeah. So would it be an over exaggeration to say if there's no phytoplankton, there's no human life?
I think, that would not be exaggerated at all. I think it is that. And coming to think of it, if we think back to the origins of life, our last universal common ancestor, Luca, as they're called sometimes, that was most likely some kind of cyanobacteria-like organism. So we wouldn't be here without them in the first place. They oxygenated our atmosphere, right? I guess life would have evolved somehow even without the kind of atmosphere that we have today. But the life that is here today wouldn't be here today if there hadn't been at some point some kind of cyanobacteria-like creature oxygenating the atmosphere. So we wouldn't be here in the first place, and I think we wouldn't be here for long without them. Yeah.
It's fascinating because I think not a lot of people know about the importance of it. I mean, a tree is something that you can see from satellite images and all that. Maybe it's just not visible enough, but crazy what's at stake there. So with that, I think let's go back into time travel mode.
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
To understand what our future holds for us and how you can actually try and tell the future. So I think we covered the first aspect of going back in time, right?
Yes, exactly. So we can go back in time, and sometimes if that's not enough, we can substitute time for space. So if we can't go back to the future, then what we do is instead of traveling in time, we travel in space.
On Wednesday, October 21st, 2015.
2015?
So for example, what we can do then is we can look at parts of the ocean, different parts of the ocean that resemble each other in many ways, but for example have been different for a long enough time in terms of certain parameters. So parts of the ocean that have been warmer, for example, parts of the oceans that are naturally rich in carbon dioxide, and we can take samples there, bring them to the lab and characterize them, and then based on these temperature gradients that we get from this what we call space for time approach, by that we can also say something about, okay, given a 4-degree increase in temperature on average, what is this going to do to this type of organisms if we assume that another thing that's quite important is that not only are our oceans becoming warmer, they are also becoming more variable. And this variability is also becoming less predictable, right? So there's this increase in mean temperature that we're seeing, that we have been seeing for a little while now. And there's also some kind of natural variability, even in parts of the ocean that are quite seasonally stable, like near the equator, where we would expect it to be kind of not so variable, but they are. They all vary to some extent. Especially in temperate regions. And what we are seeing is that this variability is becoming more and more unpredictable, so that the spikes, they become more spiky, especially towards the higher temperatures. And there are certain regions where that is more the case, and there's regions where that is less the case. For example, regions that are naturally more predictable and regions that are naturally more unpredictable. And what we can do is we can go and take samples from either which place and characterize them. And then that also helps us say something about how, for example, this increase in mean temperature or this increase in unpredictability is going to shape the characteristics of the phytoplankton that are again important for the ocean ecosystem as a whole.
I mean, the ocean covers 70% of the globe, I think. And it's so different, right? If you look at the tropics versus the Antarctic, now we have the Mediterranean and we have heat waves coming through, and there's so much in motion. Is it even possible to kind of model all of this together? Or can you look at specific parts and draw conclusions from that?
Yes. So for the modeling part, there are different types of models that do different things, right? There are these big kind of Earth system models that really consider the entire globe, and that that are more concerned than about the climate really than the biology. So typically they have like a small biology component as well. So you have these, and these really go. These cover the entire Earth. They can look at the entire Earth system, as is in the name. And what they're sometimes not very good at is then the more regional resolution. That they can't. For that you need a different model then. So you typically what you want to do is you want to combine different types of models for depending on your question, depending on the scale that your question operates on, right? And often it's kind of nested, because yes, you are interested in the big entire picture, but then maybe you want to know how does this big entire picture influence this region of interest, say the Mediterranean. And for that then you will need a different type of model, and also the different models ask for different data as well. But yes, it's a really important point that you're making with these space for time approaches, especially, is that there can also be so many confounding factors. Like if you're taking a sample, say from the Arctic, and you're taking a sample from the Mediterranean, surely the temperature is going to be different, but so is everything else, right? So in terms of the nutrients, in terms of the other organisms that live there, in terms of the human influence and pollution and all of these things. So that can make it really difficult sometimes with these space for time approaches to know whether what you're seeing is really due to your variable of interest, or is it something else, or is it how your variable of interest interacts with all of these other variables. So that can be tricky, and that's why we're always really happy if we find regions that are adjacent to each other, say two different current systems next to each other, but that are quite different in terms of not too many parameters, but just the one that we're interested in. But that is not very often the case, but it is sometimes. Sometimes we're lucky, and that helps us then come to a more powerful conclusion, I'd say.
No. And another aspect on that, and also part of the reason for the question, in the previous episode I learned that fish start to migrate to climate zones where the conditions are better for them, right? If it gets too hot, they swim north or south depending on where they are in the world.
Yeah.
Obviously, plankton can't move, right? They're dependent on the currents. So can you see that there's any kind of evolution going on within the plant itself, or are they dying, or how does that work?
Yes, so that's exactly right what you're saying. And we find quite a similar phenomenon in phytoplankton as well. So we find, for example, that there is a tropicalization of the more, say, Atlantic type phytoplankton communities, and we find a Atlantification of the Arctic communities and these kind of things. And that is, as you put quite rightly, that is not because the phytoplankton are packing their bags and saying, I've had it, I'm moving. As it has to do with the dispersal as well. And it is just that previously, when phytoplankton got dispersed, say, from the tropics into the more temperate zones, they wouldn't find the conditions there, or the niches, a free place to live, say, that would allow them to live there. And now, if they're in the tropics, they're maybe quite unhappy because they're operating very near the temperatures that would kill them off, and they get dispersed by currents somewhere closer to, say, the Atlantic, and they find the conditions there are better, so they can proliferate there a lot better. And that's how come we see, or that is one of the mechanisms by which we think we now find more tropical species, say, in the mid-Atlantic, and we find the Atlantic type species more in the Arctic. It's because the dispersal that happens in any case, and that used to make them it is because of the dispersal that happens anyways, and the fact that now they find conditions that they can actually survive in. So it's on the one hand, when the climate is changing or the environment is changing, you can move, right? Or you can be moved away to somewhere that is maybe better. You can also cope. That is often something that happens within the same generation. It's just physiology. It's like when it's getting really hot today, all of us are going to get really sweaty, right? That's physiology. That's how we deal with the warmth. And when it's cold, we start, to shiver, and the little hairs stand on edge. That's physiology. And phytoplankton also have physiology that helps them cope with changes in temperatures. So they can cope, right? And if the moving and the coping, if that doesn't work, or in addition to that, they can also evolve, right? So it's these three things. You can die as well, but let's not talk about going extinct. But it's these three things, right? It's the moving, it's the coping, and it's the evolving that is the toolbox that the phytoplankton have. The moving is a little bit, it's not something they can do actively, as you said, but it's also something that happens to them. And the degree to which either of them happens shapes what the phytoplankton are doing to a degree. So we're also interested in this interplay, right? We want to know, are they doing what they're doing because they evolved to do it? Are they doing what they're doing because they were dispersed from somewhere else? Or is this their coping strategy? And so the ones that are not moving are likely either coping or evolving or going extinct. Mostly though coping and evolving.
Would an evolution be realistic where they learn how to move?
Well, some of them can, just very slowly. I think it's their size, right? So they'd have to evolve into something quite large, possibly multicellular, and then they wouldn't be phytoplankton anymore. And phytoplankton can, on the very small scale, they can move, right? Some of them have little hairs, belly hairs that they walk on. Some of them have flagella that they can use to swim. Some of them can change how much lipids they have in their body and regulate where they sit in the water by that. If they have many lipids, they'll swim, and if they have few lipids, they'll sink. So they can move, just not on the scale that's needed for migration. And I think if they were to migrate actively, we wouldn't call that phytoplankton anymore. That'd be something else then.
Human.
And I think that would humans, yes, tiny little green humans, photosynthesizing, yes.
Fascinating. Okay, so there was the second way how we can time travel. What's the third way?
The third is going into the future.
That was the day I invented time travel.
And that we can only do in the laboratory. So for that, I use a tool called experimental evolution that comes from evolutionary biology, but has seen a lot of use also in the ecology and marine sciences in the last, I'd say, 10, 15 years. And so to do that, what we do is, or when we do that, what we do essentially is watch evolution in action as it happens. Because evolution in phytoplankton can be really fast compared to human lifetimes, right? So what you need to happen for evolution is you need, your cell needs to divide and it needs to make daughter cells, right? So either the cells need to combine and make offspring, but that makes things complicated. So for now, what we're considering is a standard phytoplankton, and those mainly make more of themselves by division, right? So one mother cell is going to divide in two daughter cells, and as that happens, the genome is going to have to be rewritten twice, right? Or once at least. Yes, once. It's going to be copied from the mother cell genome into the daughter cell genome, and each time this happens, there is the scope for an error, right? So if you imagine that, so even the smallest, or some of the smallest phytoplankton have, I think, 12.5 something million base pairs. That's a lot of letters. If you had to write, like, within a day, 12.5 million letters, very small letters, it's quite likely that a mistake would happen, right? That you'd mix up one of the letters, especially if it's the same 4 letters over and over again. And this is what happens as cells make more of themselves. Little mistakes can happen, and sometimes this little mistake, depending on where it happened, we would call that a mutation. That mutation can have an effect. It can also maybe not have an effect, but sometimes they have effects, and sometimes these effects lead to different amino acids that lead then to different proteins, and that lead to then the organism being a little bit different maybe, and maybe that slightly different organism is going to be a little bit better than the mother cell, and then it's going to make more of itself, and this little mistake is going to get copied again and again and again, and then you'll have more of the cells that have that little mistake, that little change, let's call it, maybe not a mistake, let's call it a change. And that is evolution already, right? So evolution is not necessarily speciation, going from one species to the next to the next. It just means that you end up with a population that is genetically different from the population that you started out with. That is all that's needed, and that can happen in one generation. It's not super likely that happens, that one generation is enough to lead really to a measurable change in the genotype and the associated phenotypes, but it can. Typically, what we see with phytoplankton, to really see in response to a chosen environmental change, a driver, we call it sometimes, it's about 100 generations. And because phytoplankton are so small, 100, they're so fast also, doesn't take long to divide, right? If you're a big turtle, say, at the Galapagos Island, it'll take a long time to make offspring, right? You'll have to reach maturity, and then you have to lay the eggs, and the eggs have to hatch, and all of that. It's a lot faster if you simply divide, right? So 100 generations in phytoplankton life is about a year, maybe less, depending on the type of phytoplankton. So if we want to look at what can happen, everything else being equal, in 100 generations, that's about a year of lab work, right? So what we do is we take our samples and we put them in controlled conditions that we're interested in to explore, be that temperature or carbon dioxide, an increase in carbon dioxide, or different nutrient levels, different light levels, if that's what we're interested in. And then what we do is we take that little sample and we propagate it time and time and time again, and we watch it. We watch it as it does its thing. And by that, we can get a very good idea of their evolutionary potential that they would have under different circumstances.
First of all, I'm like, okay, how many of these little tubes you must have there? That's what's going on in my head, but
Hundreds.
Hundreds.
Hundreds and hundreds.
And I'm just sometimes fascinated by the human capacity to do things and to develop the methodologies to do all these and to measure and to continuously observe it. So this is going on in one part of my head. The other part of my head is asking the question, do you see any hope in that? Like, are there good news in what you find? What does the future look?
Yes, I would say that any type of phytoplankton that we've worked with under any environmental driver, they've all evolved. Every single one of them. They've all somehow at some point done that switch from coping, to evolving, and I think that's good. So it means they're not going to go extinct. They're not going to end up in that scenario that we talked about earlier. I think the open question then is more, so what exactly are they going to be like? And it seems that they'll be fine. They're going to be expert photosynthesizers. And even more so than predicted. So there had been some predictions based on short-term studies that in the end, as temperature in particular keeps increasing, phytoplankton are going to, in the end, be respiring more than they photosynthesize because, they respire as well. They respire to fix damage, say, that occurs in the cell and these kind of things. And earlier predictions that happened based on short-term studies had been predicting that eventually as temperatures go up, the amount of respiration is going to exceed the amount of photosynthesis, which is bad for the cell and is also bad for the climate. But it seems that in the long term, at least all of the functional groups that I know have been looked at and the groups that we have looked at, the types of phytoplankton, they all seem to be able through evolution to fix that somehow. So I think that's good, because then I found that really worrying when I came across these kind of predictions that eventually, phytoplankton are going to run into that issue that they have so much damage to fix that they have to respire so much that in the end there's not very much left of whatever they're photosynthesizing. And I've been finding it quite reassuring that most likely in the long term that is not going to be the case, that they are going to be able to evolve mechanisms that allow them to keep photosynthesizing and to keep photosynthesizing more than they are respiring even at really high temperatures.
So that means more
Yes,
carbon dioxide will go into the carbon pump, will be stored at the bottom of the ocean. And at least we have one ally in maintaining human life that we can't just cut down and
Yes. If anything, I'd say they are extremely resilient. Really extremely resilient creatures. They're very small, but not to be underestimated, I think.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I read in one of your papers that specifically, and this is something that sparked hope for me, the most realistic scenarios that you tested seem to have produced the best results. So where the temperature wasn't rising stable, but had these fluctuations that we talked about earlier through heat waves or whatever.
But yes, indeed. It seems that, I guess it depends a lot on the type of fluctuation, I'd say, and the type of organisms. Some organisms might be much more vulnerable to fluctuations and to unpredictability there, and especially if we think about things maybe from the poles, I could imagine that they are not super keen on these types of fluctuations. But for temperate organisms, yes, I would say I would say that, well, again, depending on the type of fluctuation, but I think that being in a fluctuating environment helps you cope, and being able to cope helps you evolve. Yes, I would say that.
Can you already say what these findings mean for the general climate models?
I think some of the big models also have an issue in that some of them still don't consider evolution at all, and if they do, it's often a number, and that number is not very malleable. So there is talking to and fro how to do it, but myself not being a modeler, I'm not entirely sure how it's going to be implemented in the different types of models that we talked about briefly. But I know that change is happening, and that there's also more interest maybe into considering the biological component, because in the end, if I'm being honest as a biologist, I understand that climate cycles are driven not mainly by biology. It's quite a small percentage, right? But I think the understanding on the climate side of things is maybe also that the biology can be quite important in terms of that it might tip the system either which way depending on what the biology is doing. So there's interest there as well to include these slightly more realistic scenarios. Yes, so it goes both ways. I think there is ongoing talk, ongoing, and also much needed, because as you do say, sometimes the biology, the way it's considered, is in this quite static way, both in the biology itself and in the environments that the biology is in. And I think this is changing, though, slowly.
No. I mean, it's incredibly difficult.
It is, hey, to do it all.
So many variables in there, and so I'm incredibly grateful for the work that you do. And I read that you are from Belgium, right? And you
Yes.
come more out of a family of artists and not necessarily ocean people. How can someone that maybe now have listened to the conversation says like, my God, this is fascinating, but I'm not close to the ocean. I don't have anything to do with it. Maybe you can share a little bit about your story as an inspiration of what you can do with your career.
Inspiration. I should maybe also say I had a hard time at school. I wasn't particularly bad, but I had a hard time, and I did not see myself at university. I had this inkling that I wanted to be a scientist of some kind of that I knew that I wasn't an artist that I knew, but I would say yes, I was a little bit lost, and not so sure, and I did go away, and I worked and I traveled and these kind of things, and I ended up in New Zealand somehow, and they had in Auckland, I think it was, they had like a lecture series that you could just sit in without any degree and anything. You could just go and sit in, and that really somehow that really inspired me. It wasn't about oceanography. It was about plate tectonics and volcanoes and these kind of things. Also quite really interesting, but quite different. And then I somehow had some newfound enthusiasm that maybe I should at least try to get into university, because that lecture series, at least I thought, oh, this is not so bad. I guess I could do this if I, probably there's also going to be things that are going to be harder than this kind of plate tectonic stuff, but maybe I'm not as stupid as I think I am. So when I came back, I did apply to different universities, and I started doing biology. I did a lot of biochemistry as well, and then later on it was mainly like oceanography, right? And so I kind of migrated a little bit through these different things, but mainly what I did during my studies was in the end biochemistry and physical oceanography that really somehow I found super interesting. And I think it would be a little bit different. I think today I wouldn't be admitted to a master's degree these days. It's crazy sometimes when I look at the requirements that we have for our master's course, and I think like, wow, I would never have gotten in. This is so strict. So I think it can be helpful in these days to really maybe mind your grades. Yeah, as stupid as this sounds, but really mind your grades in your bachelor's. It's super unfortunate that it's become so important, but at the moment it seems to be. It didn't quite used to. You could make it up with other things that maybe you had done. And so yes, I would say unfortunately maybe really pay. If you know where you want to go, then you need to be a little bit more aware, even at an early stage. That didn't used to matter that much of grades and things like that, because in many universities the entry requirements have become really, really strict. But yes, I did my master's then in Oban, which is in Scotland on the west coast. It's a lovely, lovely place, and I had been to Scotland before for an exchange with Erasmus, and that had also been lovely. And in the end, I somehow ended up back in Edinburgh, and I did my PhD in evolutionary biology, and that was really nice because it gave me this. Well, it was nice because I work with fantastic people, and Edinburgh is lovely.
I think this episode gives enough room to be inspired of how crazy this work can be and how interconnected everything is. And talking about time travel, can you summarize it for the layman? Like, what are the big unanswered questions in your field of work?
Yes, I can. So I think I'll start by saying what we can answer, and that is that phytoplankton are going to evolve as the climate change, as the climate crisis unfolds. So that we know. I think what we don't know is what exactly are those phytoplankton that have evolved going to look like. That we don't know, and because we don't know that, we also don't really know what is the role of phytoplankton going to be in future climate systems. How are those two going to be affecting each other? But yeah, I think that's what we don't know. Yes. We don't. There was many other things we don't know, but I think to me it seems to be an important one.
So maybe we can catch up in a couple of years' time and answer the question again and
That'd be lovely.
see
Yes.
what else there is to know. Elisa, thank you so much for explaining me this in a really biology 101 style. I took a lot away. I cross my fingers that your research gives the answers to the big questions. And thank you for your work.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube and our Instagram.
Where the ocean meets.